Anything coming through? Is it good? Okay. Oh, we got sound. Is it coming through? We good? We good to go? Okay. All right. So apparently we didn't have sound there, so I'll start over with Crusader Rabbit here. So this was like the very early days animation trying to start off on television. Obviously, you could not have like as detailed animation and fluid animation as theatrical releases. So Crusader Rabbit was very, very, very minimal animation. We're talking like 2 frames to make the illusion of life. We're talking pans. We're talking limited lip syncing. But it actually proved to really work for this little cartoon of like 6-minute episodes. And it was interesting because this cartoon actually had continuity because it was so simple to make. There was actually a story behind it, which is kind of a bizarre story. It's a story about a rabbit trying to wipe out all of Texas for taking revenge on their environment. Um, like literally the narration that starts off this cartoon is that this is the rabbit who wiped out all of Texas. What a wonderful idea. Like it literally says this in the narration. Now of course it's slapsticky, it's meant to be funny, but like I mean it's kind of like trying to like play into the mindset of like kids who like playing war, like with their guns and stuff like that, kind of making pretend. um but like it plays a little bit differently today. It was very limited animation, like very simplistic characters. But because it was so cheap, this cartoon was actually able to go on for the longest time. Like the episodes went well over 100. Like now the episodes are like 6 minutes each. So they're pretty cheap to produce, but it kept going and going. And the production lasted just about a decade, depending on when you look at who was behind the show. Now I say that it only went from like the 1940s up to 1959, but it actually ran in syndication for the longest time into the 1960s because just it was easy to run in syndication. You had over 100 episodes, and you could just sell it off to networks. So that was like the very first example. A lot of people don't talk about it as much because there's way too many episodes. It ran for so long, and it's very cheap, and it's not as fun to watch unless, of course, you approach it from like looking at it as like a war cartoon. It's kind of fun in that aspect. So let's go to the next slide here. So here's like a more familiar cartoon character a lot of people know. So this is Huckleberry Hound show. So now we're entering into the era of Hanna-Barbera. And Hanna-Barbera was interesting because these guys, like, yeah, so like Hanna-Barbera, like these two guys, they worked on Tom and Jerry for the longest time. So Tom and Jerry was, picking up steam a bit in the 50s. And they were realizing that the studio had to, crunch down on the animation to save money. And both of them came up with this style of limited animation that they wanted to do for Tom and Jerry that would save them a lot of money. And apparently it went unnoticed by the studio. They might have looked at it for like a minute and then decided like, we're not going to do this. We can't do this. We're just going to repackage all the old cartoons. So the duo went off to make their own cartoon. The first one they made, which isn't as widely recognized, is Rough and Ready, which was the story of a cat and dog, and they go off on adventures. Kind of similar to like Tom and Jerry, except they talked and there was continuity. It was cheaper to make. But the other big thing about it too was they decided to make the controversial choice of having that cartoon be color, which was not as common during the late 50s. Like color television was starting to come about. It wasn't as common. Like you could kind of think of it, I guess the more modern equivalent was, the idea of, like widescreen displays of like television shows. It was kind of like in between there. Like you could set it up, like not everyone had it, but it'd be a good idea to start from there. So a lot of the cartoons did that, including Huckleberry Hound. And the reason that Huckleberry Hound appears black and white in the shot that I have here is because I wanted to find the old intro which advertised Kellogg's. Because the big thing about Hanna-Barbera, and this sort of like set the stage for, Saturday morning cartoons would follow, was that they had a huge sponsor behind it so that they could better fund the show and that it was, easier to produce. In fact, Hanna-Barbera both mentioned that when they were trying to pitch the show, they realized that, man, we were always used to just finding ways of making animation work and stories work. And now we have to be salesmen. We have to try to like go to Kellogg and say, hey, can we make this show? And one of like, I believe like the caveats of that was that they really had to push the advertisement for Kellogg's. Because the shot that I've taken from here is actually from the intro where they had to promote Kellogg's in the opening. So in this opening, it's just the Kellogg's cornflakes bird just running around doing antics while singing about Huckleberry Hound and constantly pushing cornflakes. Like Huckleberry Hound doesn't even appear in the opening. It's just the Kellogg's cornflakes bird. So yeah, sponsorship became a big thing, and cereals would become a big thing to promote it to. Huckleberry Hound also sort of launched the big Hanna-Barbera universe that everyone knows. Stuff like Yogi Bear, Quick Draw McGraw came about from all this, and it set up the format too. Like the Huckleberry Hound show wasn't just Huckleberry Hound. It was a combination of stuff like Yogi Bear, Heckle and Jekyll. So you'd have all these different characters that would come about in these shows to sort of make this anthology format, which actually came to define a lot of Hanna-Barbera cartoons for the era. It was also because like they had that advertising behind it, allowed the animation to not look as cheap, which was a big thing at the time. Like one of the cartoons from this era that I haven't referenced in the slides just because it's too horrific is Clutch Cargo, where they tried to find a way to get around lip syncing by putting live action lips on the animation. And it was freaky, and but it was cost effective. And yeah, it's so like the Huckleberry Hound show came out around the same time that stuff like Clutch Cargo and more limited animation was coming out. So it really set the bar pretty high for what you could do with animation on television. So we'll go to the next slide here. And this is where Hanna-Barbera animation sort of took off into a different direction, realizing that, they could do more than just, have stuff for kids. The Flintstones is kind of more or less considered the kind of when like animation could become a sitcom, because as anyone will tell you who like watched the show and is familiar with the era, it's essentially the honeymooners. It's the honeymooners with like a prehistoric angle on it. It takes place with like cavemen and dinosaurs in this world where they rely on animals for everything. But at its core, every episode is essentially a similar setup for like a sitcom. Fred Flintstone will take on a wacky job, or they'll have an issue at home. There'll be like a domestic squabble or something like that. Typical sitcom format for the era. And this was kind of Hanna-Barbera's first huge show to take off. Like it was pitched more in prime time, and it was pitched more to adults. And you can tell that from like some of the advertising they had from the era. Like one of the big things that they promoted was Winston cigarettes. Like there was a whole ad where like Barney and Fred were talking about how much they love Winston cigarettes and that they would smoke up, during like commercial breaks. And yeah, like you don't see that ad as often, which is kind of weird because like as over time, the Flintstones became more recognized as like kids entertainment. They didn't really smoke in the show or anything like that, but when you have that sponsorship, it's a little bit questionable about who is this show targeting. Now, of course, as the show kind of went on, it became less targeted for adults and more for like for families, and then eventually more for kids. And this had to do with the sponsorship. Obviously, they went away from Winston cigarettes, and it became better associated with eventually, yeah, like the cereals of like Post, Fruity Pebbles and Cocoa Pebbles, as well as the iconic Flintstone vitamins. But one of like I think their biggest sponsors they had switching away from cigarettes was Welch's. So grape juice advertising in there. So yeah, but yeah, the Flintstones was kind of one of their bigger hits, considering it went on for 6 years, which is longer than any of the other shows they had at that era that didn't have to go through different iterations. Especially because like to make like a half-hour animated sitcom was kind of like a huge deal at the time. So it kind of redefined how people were looking at animation at the time. So we'll go on to the next slide here, and this is again like kind of like testing the limits of how far you can go with animation, which was like this like Hanna-Barbera had gone from stuff like Huckleberry Hound going over stuff like Clutch Cargo to Johnny Quest, which was something that you had never seen in television that looked just this good. Like it was based on the the comic illustrations of Doug Wildley. So you would have characters who would look very proportionate. They would have like realistic features. They would have like bold outlines around them, and just a level of detail you did not see in animation at the time. The story is somewhat simple. It's Johnny Quest, this boy adventurer who travels around with his dad of Dr. Quest, his bodyguard of Race Bannon, their companion Haji, and their dog Bandit. And they basically just they go globetrotting. They'd stop weird threats of like mummies and lizard men and weird robot spiders. A lot of people will know this better as kind of like the inspiration for the parody behind the Venture Brothers. It's the same. In fact, like Johnny Quest characters actually make cameos in that show. Now, something about Johnny Quest is like this is kind of when you can see when adults started to take notice of what was going on in cartoons and started coming down on them hard. Like Johnny Quest was like kind of like the last like kind of like the last show of like the 60s that tested how much you could get away with in a kids cartoon in terms of like of violence and sex appeal and just how far you could go with it. Like they would bring up characters who would have romantic relationships with Race. They would get involved with adventures where they would shoot at people and throw grenades at them. People would be killed by aliens and robots, and they wouldn't get back up. And that was kind of a big deal in 1964 to have like a kids cartoon where characters were killed. And you can see like later when we get later into the 80s, you'll see that they were came down very hard on stuff like this. And it wasn't just kind of like one of those like post airing things where like adults eventually got around to looking at Johnny Quest and like, oh man, that's pretty terrible. We can't have our kids watching that. It became apparent pretty early that adults were looking at this show and go like wow, that's pretty adult for a kids show. And they started to come down hard on studios to censor it. And the other thing too is like there's a lot of stuff in the show that is very questionable that actually hasn't made it into like DVDs and re-airings of it. Like there was footage that was edited like quite immediately. Like there's and it's not so much violence, it's more or less there's a lot of like racist dialogue that was taken out of the show that really doesn't fit. Like there's commenting on like the Orient Express and the color people's skin. That stuff has been removed from DVDs and re-airings of it, and not like a recent wave. Like this happened kind of like immediately after they aired. They were edited for syndication so that they could better sell them without adult groups coming after the show. Now the show only lasted for 2 seasons, and it's interesting because like the second season was like it didn't go very far after that, mainly because they couldn't keep up with the production of the show. Like it was such a high quality that after the first season, the second season, they got more animators to work on it. But these were animators who had only worked on stuff like the Flintstones and Yogi Bear and Magilla Gorilla. They were not used to drawing realistic features. And in fact, many of them were having breakdowns just trying to get the stuff to work in animation. So if you actually watch the second season, there's a lot of scenes where the characters are too simplified, where they look like characters who would move and interact in the same way that they would in stuff like the Flintstones. So like the show just kind of didn't keep going just because it couldn't really work for the production. Which was, I mean, it wasn't like a huge loss to Hanna-Barbera. They were still working on like the Flintstones at the time. They were still working on Yogi Bear and stuff like Huckleberry Hound. Like they had a Yogi Bear movie coming out at the time. So wasn't a huge loss, but it did kind of like define that era. So we'll go on to the next slide here, and this was another cartoon that where the handcuffs kind of like where you could see where they were coming on. Like Johnny, like if Johnny Quest was like signaled like that parents were gonna like take note of cartoons and trying to like handcuff them and censor them more, this was like the one cartoon that just went over the edge. So Speed Racer, obviously based on the the English adaptation of the anime Mach Go Go Go, is basically like a combination of wacky races and death race. It's a combination of both. So uh, every like the stories would encompass like 3 or 4 episodes where a speed racer would go on a race with his superpowered car, and he would run into trouble with other cars that would try to kill him. Cars would bring out machine guns and razor blades, and a lot of racers would get killed during these races. So it was pretty chaotic. And I remember when I first watched this cartoon, I remember I watched it on Cartoon Network when it was airing in the evenings at like 9 p.m. And I sort of questioned, like, okay, why is this cartoon on at 9 p.m.? And then when I started watching it, it kind of became more apparent why it wasn't more in afternoon rotations. And that's because, every episode you'd see a handful of racers die in big explosions or get shot up or something like that. And I'll never forget one of like the key moments that made me realize how hardcore this cartoon was is there's an episode where the racers have to go along cliffs, and there's a huge bridge that gets torn out while they're during the race. And every racer basically stops at this cliffside where there's like a bridge connecting it, and basically realize, well, what are we going to do? Like, we have to get to the other side. Do we go around? What do we do? And one racer says, I'm going to jump it. You can all stay here. I'm still in this race. So he jumps it. The car crashes, it explodes, and he goes down in a fiery pit of flames. And every racer just looks at this and says, well, that's not going to happen to me. And then one by one, they keep going over the cliff, and they just keep dying and exploding. And I think even Speed suffers like a huge loss. Like his car tumbles down too. And it just makes you realize, wow, this show that aired in the 60s was pretty hardcore for it, especially when you look at like the 2008 live action film they made off Speed Racer, where everyone escapes with like a giant bubble that saves them. And it's great because like when you consider like kids are going to watch it, it's like, man, that movie was pretty great, except for all the bubbles that saved everyone. Wouldn't it be great if the cars just crashed and nobody came back and there were consequences? And yeah, Speed Racer was that. So yeah, let's go to the next slide here. So now we're in the 1970s. So I was talking a lot about how handcuffs were coming onto cartoons, and the 70s was kind of like the start of that, where you could see that cartoons were starting to not have as much like action, and we're trying to tone it down for a kid audience. So DC Comics, this was kind of like the first merging between like Hanna-Barbera and DC Comics. DC Comics in the 60s had originally had a deal with Filmation, but it's not as well remembered just because it was so cheap for the time. Like there's a great story from Filmation about how they basically staged a fake studio so that they could convince DC to let them make like a Superman and a Batman animated series that were ridiculously cheap for the time. I mean, they're not terrible. We're not talking like Clutch Cargo level, but they had pretty limited animation. So Super Friends is still like a little bit limited animation, but Hanna-Barbera was improving a little bit over time. Like during the 70s, this was during the era where Scooby-Doo took off, and basically every cartoon was basically that mystery solving team, and you'd have to insert like a dog character or some other weird talking pet. And Super Friends was not above this. Super Friends was just kind of like the boiled down version of the Justice League. So you would have characters like like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, but then they would include the junior Super Friends, who not many people remember because this is from the very first season in 1973, which is basically Wendy, Marvin, and Wondermutt. And these characters were inserted so that I believe like the reasoning was that they inserted them because they didn't think that kids would be able to relate to adult superheroes. Like, yeah, what kids gonna relate to Batman or Superman? You know, other than the fact that a lot of kids read the comics and they really like watching their adventures. But it's weird because like the what's really weird about the first season of Super Friends is that it's probably the worst iteration because they couldn't fight like supervillains. If they did fight a villain, they would have to fight like a robot or something, somebody who they could punch and it wouldn't be like a person or like an imitatable act, or they would try to help people out during a natural disaster. And that was basically the extent of all the episodes that they did. And then in between there'd be like a little puzzle that like the junior Super Friends would have to solve. And these episodes were an hour long. um and when I say like an hour long, I don't mean like they dice them up into like various stories. It's one story complete for an hour long, and it slogs so far through it. Now, the good news is that, like, a lot of people will question, like, well, why would people like Super Friends aside from it just being like the first iteration of the Justice League in animation? And that's because over time, each version of the Super Friends got a little bit better. Like after this came the amazing, not the all new Super Friends hour where they did dice up segments. They introduced the Wonder Twins, who a lot of people found were kind of fun because they could transform into like form of an eagle, form of steam, and all that. They would add more characters in there. They would try to add. By the time they got to the 80s, they would try to add in more diverse characters, which were kind of still stereotypes. So they were really kind of like, like I said, baby steps towards making this show like better. That by the time you got to like the mid 80s, they were actually doing like episodes you wouldn't expect Super Friends to do. Like there was an episode where they talked about Batman's origins, where his parents died. They brought Darkseid into the mix. They had an episode on Superman's the death of Superman, and this was like about like 6 years before like the whole death of Superman arc happened in the comics. So they actually treaded into some pretty interesting territory as the show went on. I think probably the one version that people are most nostalgic for is Challenge of the Super Friends, which happened the late 70s, and that's when you got the Legion of Doom came in of like Lex Luthor and Brainiac and Solomon Grundy and all the classic villains everyone knows. That's like kind of the midway point that most people recognize as kind of like the fun, campy Super Friends era. So it took a while for them to perfect this formula. So we'll go on to the next slide. And we haven't talked too much about anime so much in here. And that's mainly because a lot of anime was toned down and kind of like Americanized. Like I'll talk more about this later today in like the Americanization panel. But the extent was that you would have to, make that they were trying to make Japanese animation more palatable for American audiences. Battle of the Planets, however, was kind of like a weird example because it wasn't so much that they were trying to Americanize this anime, but they were trying to make it fit a formula for what was in demand at the time. So the original anime was called Science Ninja Team Gatchaman, and it's basically a team of teenage superheroes. They dressed up as birds. They traveled around the world in their giant jet, and they fought giant robots and sinister villains who also appeared with masks and spandex and all that. So typical superhero stuff. Now they changed it, however, to Battle of the Planets because in the late 70s there was this little science fiction film that came out called Star Wars, and when it became a big hit, everyone wanted Star Wars on television. Anything that you could find to make related to Star Wars or science fiction, television wanted it and needed it because there wasn't too much of it at the theater, and television was like, we need to hop on this now. Hanna-Barbera tried to do this by reviving a lot of like their old science fiction shows, so stuff like Space Ghost and the Herculoids. They revived in this show called Space Stars, which they made like an hour long. They tried to bring in more sci-fi shows, like they did a spin-off of the Jetsons with just Astro, which is weird. So Battle of the Planets basically tried to rework Gatchaman to be more science fiction-y. And the way that they did this was they tried to make it so that it took place on other planets. So they rewrote the show so that instead of a superhero team traveling around Earth trying to stop threats of robots and aliens, they would travel around to other planets. that happened to look like Earth. So yeah, they rewrote it, and to sell this more, what they actually did with the show is, which was kind of rare at the time, they animated an entirely new character just for the show. This sort of goofy trash compactor robot called Seven Zark Seven. And he would basically send the team on their missions. Like in the original show, they had a scientist dad who would basically inform them and keep them and give them their missions. But in this show, this ridiculous robot would kind of send them on all their missions and would kind of speak like C3PO most of the time. And of course, they now in addition to that, they also did like the usual edits that they would make to Japanese animation, to remove more violence, remove mentions of death as much as they could. They would try to do a little bit more of the digital editing techniques of trying to remove guns and stuff like that. And when I say digital, I mean they would try to like alter the frame. So basically, they would have to get a little bit crafty. A lot of people don't realize this, that before the age of like digitally taking stuff out of anime to edit it, you would basically have to alter the film. And since they were already animating Seven Arc 7, it was a little bit easier for them to get used to like taking out like guns from scenes and trimming stuff down. The other thing too that I want to mention is that they would try to make moral edits to this film, to this series, which I found kind of interesting. Like, there's a classic example. There's an episode where a woman has her father killed by a giant robot, and she wants to get revenge on the giant robot. So there's a scene where the Science Ninja team basically take her on their jet and give her the opportunity to blow up the robot, to give her the chance to get her revenge. Now, in Battle of the Planets, the way that they edit it is that she's given the opportunity to press this button and blow up the robot, and she basically refuses. And they say, "Good, revenge is not the way to go." And there's your moral message of the episode. Now, in the original Japanese version, however, when she refuses, the main hero smacks her across the face and grabs her hand and forces her to push the button, saying, "No, you have to take revenge." So it was a little bit grittier and a little bit like questioning of how heroic you can view these characters. So so it was a little bit more like Battle of the Planets is weird because it wasn't just a case of like editing out Japanese references, changing names, changing music, and just taking out the violence. Like there were edits made for moral reasons, there were edits made for commercial reasons, all that contorted it into Battle of the Planets. Now, of course, a lot of people who are familiar with Gatchaman will know that in the 1980s, they attempted to edit the show again by calling it G-Force. And G-Force was a little bit more, it was a little bit more faithful to Gatchaman. Like, it still took place on Earth. They didn't, the names they chose weren't as ridiculous. Like, they didn't rewrite one of the characters to speak in bird talk. I forget which character, but yeah, like in Battle of the Planets, one of the characters, they edited so the character just speaks like a bird, like it would just go like brr, brr, like that's the way that they would talk throughout the entire show. So G-Force was a little bit more faithful. My only big problem with G-Force is that if you watch it, you can tell that they only composed like 3 synthesized songs for the show because they keep reusing the same synth track over and over and over. So it's harder to watch that show than it is Battle of the Planets, which actually had like a full orchestra score, which is probably the best thing that I can say about Battle of the Planets. Like the music was actually pretty cool. So we'll go on to the next slide, and this is another example of anime that was reworked into cartoon for the American market, which was Star Blazers, better known as Space Battleship Yamato. And the reason, which should be pretty obvious why they tried to Americanize it, was they wanted to remove references to the Yamato battleship that went down during war that was representational of the Japanese Navy. So like because if you watch like the original cartoon, there's a scene where they flash back to when the Yamato sunk during battle. So they tried to remove references to war in there so that it wasn't very specific, to referencing this stuff. This was pretty common too. Like they edited back in the 60s, they edited the show Iron Man 28 which became known as Gigantor because like he was named Iron Man 28 because he was like the 28th model in robots that were going to be used during World War II by the Japanese. So of course they removed like the Japanese reference there. They had name changes there. But the show still kind of had like a bit of like a cult status because it's Leiji Matsumoto, who did really cool stuff like Galaxy Express 999. It reflected like kind of like this desire for more space opera type stuff. Like like I said, Star Wars at the time, so there was a big need for sci-fi, and this kind of reflected a lot of the void that some of the Trekkies were feeling when they were longing for Star Trek. Because like the other thing too is that it was a story with continuity, so you would have to tune in every week because like the first season was all about Earth was decimated and the space battleship Yamato had to travel to this other planet to find this device that would help restore the Earth. So what I'm saying is Interstellar ripped off Star Blazers. No, there's tons of stories like that. So Star Blazers kind of took off as kind of like a cult status. It debuted in syndication when that was starting to become a huge thing, and you could better promote shows through local networks and stuff like that. And Star Blazers was interesting because it had a cult following in that not every network bought it after the second season. Like the third season, which is known as the Bowler Wars, only debuted in a few markets, so it was kind of considered like episodes because it was only the most devoted of markets that would air it. That would air it. And that's mainly because syndication was kind of like an iffy thing. It was kind of like you pushed it out there and it wasn't as economical. But as you'll see once we get into the 80s, it was a little bit easier to push syndication. So we'll go on to the next slide here. And now we're into the 1980s. And this is where we enter into a very, very weird era of cartoons. So basically, up to this point, like Saturday morning cartoons, when they debuted on Saturday morning, were relegated to the big networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. And this was kind of an era where they were starting to get a little bit desperate for new content. Because like Scooby-Doo had been a constant throughout the 70s, but it kept changing and it was like fluctuating in the ratings. So they were trying to find new ideas. And one of their big things that they wanted to tap into was already established properties. And most of these properties were based on stuff that was already airing on television so that you could better appeal to the adults, I guess. So like you would have like, the typical shows that would run in the primetime time slots, and then on Saturday mornings you would have the kid version of it. And some of these cartoons are really weird. Like the Fonz and the Happy Gang is one of the more bizarre examples because it's basically taking the idea of Happy Days and throwing in a time travel aspect. Because like the whole premise behind this show is that there's a woman from the future called Cupcake who comes back with a time machine and invites Fonz and the Happy Days gang to travel through time with them. And they basically get lost in time and have to find their way back to the 1950s. And it was so bizarre. Like a lot of it didn't work. It was typical time travel antics. They tried to add in like, the cute character. And it was just strange. Like, I mean, to be fair, it wasn't too out of the wheelhouse with like Happy Days. It was in its like final seasons and struggling to find weird plot lines with aliens and stuff like that. But this wasn't just inherent to like Happy Days. Like it continued on. Because if you go to the next slide, this is probably one of the most infuriating cartoons that I've seen of the era, which is Gilligan's Planet. So like there had already been like a Gilligan's Island animated series in the 70s, and it was kind of nothing. But because, like I said, there's still a sci-fi angle going, they had to have this show called Gilligan's Planet, where a bunch of people who were too stupid to build a boat to get off an island somehow built a spaceship and went into space and then got lost and then crash landed on a planet. And they basically have sci-fi adventures. Now, one of the things that they would try to promote at the time was that, you could get celebrity voices for it. So like the majority, I think like 90% of the original cast of Gilligan's Island returns for this, which is, I guess, kind of a big deal. It's kind of like one last show for like the whole cast to get involved with. which you can tell these actors were really up there in age, where they were like struggling to get lines out. In fact, a few of them like kind of died pretty recently after this show aired. But it's just like such a strange thing. You would try to like make Gilligan's Island work with more of like a sci-fi angle. And like one of the other things I want to mention is that this was a show by Filmation, who they were a studio that was struggling to find more stuff to do at the time, because they had just kind of like finished up making their big, like Filmation's biggest hit in the 70s was Fat Albert. Like Fat Albert took off. It was a great show. It's like in the same way that Scooby-Doo kept Hanna-Barbera going throughout the 70s, Fat Albert kept Filmation going. And by the 80s, they were struggling for more content, but then they became more notable for another cartoon we'll get to. So go to the next slide here, and this is kind of like the one last kind of celebrity cartoon that I'll talk about here, which is Mr. T, based on the A-Team. And it was basically Mr. T travels around the country in his van full of gymnasts and teenagers, and they solve mysteries. What I wanted to bring up this cartoon in particular because Mr. T appears in live action bookended segments in this show. And it's kind of weird because like he's there to like push a moral message of the episode, but also explain what's going to happen in the story. And the moral and the adventure that they go on don't mesh well. You can tell that they're really forced. Like they would have to go solve like a mission of like missing gold, like some bandits have stolen it. But then they would also try to talk about anorexia during the episode. So, and they really didn't connect. It was just like every so often the adventure would stop and they'd talk about a moral message, and they would just keep going with it. But it's weird that like Mr. T was one of the examples of a show that took off and that it went on for more than one season. So obviously it was connecting with someone. It did become a staple. There were like advertisements for it. And then of course, as referenced in the Pee-wee movie, there was a Mr. T cereal. So Mr. T eventually kind of took off that audience. And as a lot of people point out, there was a lot of like Mr. T merchandise at the time. There was like a Mr. T album more centered for kids that came about because of that too. So just bizarre stuff, but they were trying anything that they could with network television. So if you go to the next slide, now this is where syndication became like a bigger thing. So one of the first cartoons to kind of push further for syndication was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And this was mainly because He-Man already had toys that they had to push out there. So syndication was kind of not as highly regarded as having like a network deal where your stuff would premiere on like Saturday mornings on like the big networks. But for syndication, He-Man was pitched a little bit differently. It was pitched more as kind of like as a commercial. As a lot of people point out, this was for the benefit of like pushing out toys there to sell it. And this mainly had to do with the era of deregulation of how you would push out content for children. Like it used to be in the 70s, they had a bit of a requirement that there had to be cartoons on the air that would push for moral messaging and for educational purposes. So obvious examples of this would be stuff like Schoolhouse Rock, which had like musical numbers that would teach kids about math and language and reading. And what happened at the very beginning of the 1980s is that one of the things that Reagan pushed for was having more of like a free market. And part of that meant that a lot of the requirements for cartoons and kids entertainment basically kind of evaporated. So you could sell, like shows like this, which didn't really have to have a moral message, it didn't really have to have a moral message woven into it, is kind of more what I meant to say here. Because He-Man did actually have like bookended segments where they would do a PSA, where they would talk about something. They could still have their adventures and do whatever they wanted, but then at the end of the episode, they would have to mention, don't talk to strangers, don't do drugs, pretty simple PSA stuff. But the main goal of He-Man was to push for toys and to get those toys out there. And it went on for quite a bit of time. It became a popular thing. I was, to put my own cards on the table here, I was born in 1985, and I still watched like the show in syndication when it came out. So He-Man was kind of like my first cartoon. So this is kind of more my era. So if you go on to the next frame, next slide here, we'll talk about the other big toy line at the time, which is G.I. Joe. And basically everything from Hasbro at this point. Like Hasbro was a toy line, and they were pushing stuff out there. G.I. Joe was kind of interesting because there had already been G.I. Joe toys out on the market. So now you were going to have this new iteration of G.I. Joe. So this was, you could kind of think of this as like kind of the first cartoon toy remake, if you will. Kind of want to think about that. And this kind of like set the tone for how you would push shows like this, which was they created a 5-episode pilot. Much different from just making an animated pilot of 1 episode, and then you push it out into a new season. Typically, how they would do this is they would make 5 episodes, just like a simple contained, 5-part story. You would push it out into syndication, and then, if the markets liked it, they would buy it up, and then they would demand, more seasons. And this is what happened with G.I. Joe. Like the first 5 episodes are like self-contained, or like a self-contained 5-part arc, and then, you would get into the show, which had more. There were 2-parters, but they're also self-contained episodes. And then if you go to the next slide here, there's, of course, the more obvious one that everyone remembers, which is Transformers. So, like Transformers really took off. That was like the big toy line of the era. So basically, He-Man and G.I. Joe walked so that Transformers could run. Now, of course, yes, Transformers does have more of a history within Japan. Like they were pushing a lot of this stuff before we were. They were pushing a lot of like the superhero stuff and the mecha stuff like long into the 70s before they became a bigger thing in the 80s where they came about. So Transformers was kind of the big thing that hit really hard at the time. And Transformers actually kind of like stole a little bit of like the thunder from G.I. Joe, because at the time they were going to make a film for both Transformers and G.I. Joe. And one of the big things that both films decided was like, it'd be really cool to do in our film, which would really shock our audience. What if we kill off the main hero? That'd be such a big thing. So apparently, I don't know if this is fully true or not, but apparently there was a rumor going about that both films were doing it at the time. And apparently G.I. Joe was the first one to do it. They were going to say, hey, you know what? We're going to kill off Duke and G.I. Joe. And I think the Transformers people saw it's like, oh, that's so cool. We should kill off Optimus Prime. And so the Transformers movie came out first. And then once it came out, they had the scene where Optimus Prime died. And not only that, like lots of Transformers died in this. But when Optimus Prime died, it was like a huge emotional moment. And it was a scene that kids were not prepared for. And initially Hasbro thought they were doing the right thing, because they thought like, this line of, toy robots is getting along, and, their fad is going to fade. So let's go into some other, Autobots and Decepticons. So we'll just retire this line. So like we'll take Megatron out of the equation. We'll take Optimus out of the equation. It'll be fine. We'll get the next generation. But apparently kids were so traumatized by this that apparently like G.I. Joe pulled back. So like if you watch the G.I. Joe movie, Duke does actually die, and it's like in the finished animation, like he gets stabbed by one of Serpentor's snakes, and it shows him just like die, and his last words are "Yo, Joe." They had to edit some lines in there that said, "Oh, he went into a coma," or "He passed out," and that actually plays into the next slide, which you get to here, which is Voltron, Defenders of the Universe. So Voltron kind of set the stage for how anime would be adapted in the era, which was combining different anime. So it's very fitting that Voltron itself was a combination of 2 anime series that had nothing to do with each other, similar to how Voltron assembled everything. So Voltron really took off with a lot of people, but Voltron was edited so that it could be more palatable for syndication. So the big thing that they edited with Voltron was death. Death was taken out of just about everything that happened in Voltron, and there was a lot of it. Characters got sliced up, they got gored, they killed monsters, innocent people died, and they had to find ways around it. So they not only use like the coma technique, which I mentioned from GI Joe, like one of the characters, Sven, dies pretty early in the series, and they write it so that he just went into a coma, and that was the end of him. Um, well, like that, they ushered him out so they could bring in like the other characters. But then they would have to find creative ways to get around it. Like they would say that this character went to another dimension, or this character was just a robot, or this character just got out in time. They would find all these weird ways to write out different examples of like trying to get around death. What's even more crazy is that Voltron actually they tried to like put the coma thing on Sven and then actually wrote him back into the show with like the next series. So like this character's like, well, this character kind of looks like Sven, and then just continued on with the character from there. So yeah, the handcuffs were on pretty big for this type of show. So if you go to the next slide, and this is like, and here's like an example of where it's kind of like the opposite. Robotech, which was a combination of three series, three mecha series, so Macross, Southern Cross, and Mospeada. Now, and this show actually has death, and actually, and it's interesting here because they Robotech embraced the idea of dying in battle because they wanted this show to be truthful. Because one of the things that the people who are behind Robotech looked into that they took note of, which was this felt like an actual war. And it actually like treated, like it talked about like, people in the service and, what it's like to fly and risk your life and realize that when you go into war, when you hop into a fighter jet and go off and start shooting at other jets, there's a good chance that you might not come back alive. And it's interesting because when they were trying to develop the series, they actually talked about like, could we do this? Could we have like characters die in a cartoon? And they said, well, like I think like the stipulation was as long as you have characters die in battle and that it seems like they didn't really die in vain and you're being truthful about it, you could get away with that. Which was easy, which made editing Robotech a little bit easier because then all they really had to worry about was editing out, nudity and sex and a bit of the blood. And I say like a bit of the blood because there's some blood in the show. Like they were really like skating the line of like how far you could go with anime showing violence. Like I think like there's a whole weird like level that you can do it. Like you can show violence, you can show a little bit of blood, but like you can't show like bullet wounds or you can't show like a finger getting sliced off, stuff like that. So they really rode the line of how much you could get away with in animation. And I'm really surprised. Like I was surprised by how much they allow for this show and how relatable it is because like this show actually became more appealing to like a higher audience. Like they actually mentioned they were trying to scale upwards to like audience of like 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and they actually found out that a lot of adults actually got into the show as well, which is kind of interesting for a syndicated show that was running at like 6:30 a.m. in most markets. Like it was running like really really early. But it actually took off and it actually had a pretty big fan base with it. It also just delights me that the fact that they didn't cut the episode called like I think they call it Rainy Night. It's just an episode where the characters of where two of the women who work on the bridge just sit around, drink wine, and talk about like the lovers that they've lost in their life. I was really surprised to see that from like a kids show that would embrace that. So like this show kind of resonated more with adults. And in fact, I remember hearing like from some of the producers that they would get fan letters from people who actually served in the military and said, wow, this show got a lot right, that I was surprised by that you could have this in a cartoon. So, and yeah, like, of course, like it did dice up, it did change names and did make generational changes to make all the anime connect. But yeah, but yeah, like they're now we can watch the uncut versions of them now, so it's not like a huge deal. But Robotech always kind of have like a special place in my heart for that. So go to the next slide, and we're running a little bit out of time here, so I'll try to kind of like blow through most of these big ones here. Thundercats was basically like an 80s mash of everything that I kind of like love in like adventure cartoons. You have different planets, you have robots, you have witches, you have curses, you have magical swords, you have cat people, you have mummies. you have mutants, there's so much crazy stuff in here. There's a space cop. There's so much fun stuff in Thundercats that even though it has like very stilted dialogue from the Rankin Bass people who have made stuff like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and stuff like that, there's a soft spot in my heart for Thundercats, which is why a lot of people keep returning to it and why they're apparently still moving ahead on making a Thundercats movie. So we'll go to the next slide here. So we're getting more towards the end of the 80s, and the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse kind of like launched like the next wave of cartoon creators for the 90s. So Mighty Mouse, this version of Mighty Mouse was produced more by Ralph Bakshi. Now, a lot of people know Ralph Bakshi did more adult animation in the 1970s with like Fritz the Cat and stuff like that. But in the 1960s, he had worked in Saturday morning cartoons like Spider-Man and Deputy Dog and a few other shows. So basically, he wanted to get back into the Saturday morning cartoon game, and he pitched a lot of stuff. None of it took. He got really angry. He says, like, basically, like, networks wanted marquee value from him. So, like, we went on established properties. Like, established property, I'll do Mighty Mouse. He didn't really have the rights to Mighty Mouse, but he decided, like, you know what? Fine, I'll find a way to grab it, and I'll grab every animator I know. And a lot of the people he grabbed for the show are people who went on to work on other stuff. So names like Paul Dini, John Cristofalusi, Eddie Fitzgerald, a few people that, like Bruce Timm, a lot of familiar faces who would go on to make stuff like Tiny Toons and Batman, stuff like that. So Mighty Mouse was also very controversial because it got canceled off the air for a scene where Mighty Mouse crushes a flower, grinds it into dust, and snorts it like. And the show always pushed that line. Like, if you watch it, like, it's a clear predecessor to Ren and Stimpy in terms of how many in-jokes and how much parody they had going about it with satire. There's a lot of like John K's like drawings that you can see in there that are exaggerated and over the top. So kind of like the start of all that. So go to the next slide. We've got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, my first huge cartoon that I loved. Big deal at the time. It was at adapting, a comic book such as this that was kind of a little bit more darker and grittier, and then went to this more fun version of it. I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the toys, and the great thing about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is that it has not stopped. Like the cartoon went up to 96, and by the time I got the 90s, it was weird. It was like trying to change itself to fit Batman the Animated Series. But it kept going with different iterations. There was live action show. There's been numerous animated shows. There continue to be new Ninja Turtles shows and movies to this day. It has never stopped. It's like Pokemon. It'll be here forever. So we'll go to the next slide. And Tinytune Adventures. This is where, a lot of like the big stuff, the big people like Bruce Timm and Paul Dini and everyone started off. And Tiny Toons became a hit because it started making 1990s animation more fluid. They realized, hey, if you put money behind it, you can make animation more fluid and it can look, not as limited. You can do more with it. And this kind of started off with Disney when they did DuckTales, because DuckTales was like a step above the rest of the animated series out there. But this was kind of a bigger deal because Tiny Toons was pitched to the bigger network. So like Fox was just starting to come up with like Saturday morning cartoons of the era, and Tiny Toons was like a big selling point for that, where they, where Warner Brothers was kind of pushing their brand through there. Disney kind of went off in their weird direction by basically having a syndicated package. A few people will know that Disney Afternoons, and the whole deal with Disney Afternoons was that you couldn't just buy DuckTales. You had to buy everything. You bought Darkwing. If you wanted DuckTales, you had to buy Darkwing Duck. You had to buy Goof Troop. You had to buy the whole big shebang package. So they basically owned syndication at that point. So if you want to pick a point where syndication died, it was kind of with Disney. And Tiny Toons kept going through there. Go on to the next slide. And I'll kind of go rapid fire since we're running out of time here. So this is Ren and Stimpy. Obviously took off with John Kay. Pretty influential of the era. It does have some darker stuff that went on behind the scenes. There's a great documentary you can check out called Happy, Happy, Joy, Joy that goes into more of it. But needless to say, it inspired a lot of other animators. We'll go to the next slide. Batman the Animated Series. I doubt that I have to go that much into why this show is great and why a lot of people still revere it today. People still talk about it. If you don't know why it's so great, please look it up. There will be no shortage of people who will tell you how much they love this show and why it resonates for them. I have a great story about it, but I don't have time for it in this. We'll go to the next slide. Rocco's Modern Life pushed the bar for adult animation with Nicktoons, addressed a lot of more adult topics, and it came back to do more adult topics with the revival of Static Cling. Go on to the next slide here. Animaniacs, Warner Brothers' most meta show ever. Very satirical, mainly for adults. Also had a revival, kept up the satire for adults. Wonderful show that is more fun to watch now as an adult than you were a kid with all the stuff that went over your head. Go to the next slide. We've got Reboot, the first big CGI animated show for television. Really weird to go back and watch now that they talk about stuff like JPEGs and bits and all that stuff, terminology that we know now that plays a little bit differently today, but went on for quite a long time. Next slide, Sailor Moon. Doubt I have to talk that much about Sailor Moon. Created like a big fandom for anime that a lot of people loved. Go to the next slide. This is the American version of Sailor Moon. It was never made. It was only like kind of existed in a pilot during negotiation and thankfully died. So you might not like the Deke version, but at least we didn't get this. Next slide, Beast Wars, Transformers. I grew up with it. My favorite version of Transformers ever made. I know that's going to cause some waves to the G1 people, but whatever. Next slide, Dragon Ball Z. Of course, I doubt I have to talk that much about Dragon Ball Z to the big anime crowd we got here. It inspired a lot of people. It was severely edited, but then over time got a little bit better. Next slide, Superman the Animated Series continued on with all the stuff that I love from Batman the Animated Series, but actually had continuity and went darker and embraced more depth and actually gave more volume to the character. And then next slide, final one, Batman Beyond. Warner Brothers told Bruce Timm to make something for the kids that wasn't as dark as Batman, and in response they made Batman Beyond as a big middle finger to them, saying we're going to make the darkest cartoon ever. So there you go. All of the 20th century covered there quickly. I always run out of time with this panel, but I'm glad that we got as far as we did. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the panel. You can check out my stuff at movieswithmark.com for more of my writings and stuff like that. And yeah, I'll be doing more panels today. So I'll see you then.